My son-in-law looked me dead in the eye across the polished marble bar of the restaurant I paid for and told me I was an embarrassment. He did not whisper it. He did not pull me aside. He leaned into the microphone they had set up for the grand opening toast and said, in front of 47 investors, 3 journalists, and the mayor's liaison, that my presence was making the room uncomfortable, that his establishment had a certain image to protect, that perhaps I would be more comfortable waiting outside. I was wearing my best sport coat. I had shined my boots. I had driven 4 hours from Abilene to Dallas in my truck to watch my daughter cut the ribbon on the restaurant I had funded with 31 years of my life savings. I did not move. I looked at him. I looked at my daughter, who stood 3 feet away holding a glass of champagne, and I watched her laugh at something the woman beside her said. She did not defend me. She did not put down her glass. She laughed, and the sound of it traveled across that marble floor and hit me somewhere below the sternum. I stood up without rushing. I buttoned my sport coat. I said nothing. I walked through the crowd, which parted for me the way crowds part for men who have learned to take up exactly as much space as they need and not 1 inch more. I walked out the glass front door of Maison Ellery onto the sidewalk of McKinney Avenue, and I stood there in the warm Dallas night with the noise of the party at my back. I did not call anyone. I did not go to my truck and sit and cry. I am 67 years old. I have buried a wife. I have buried a business partner. I have outlasted droughts and recessions and a construction market that tried to swallow me whole twice before I was 40. I do not cry on sidewalks. I pulled out my phone and I made 1 call. My attorney picked up on the 2nd ring. I told him to pull the loan agreement on Maison Ellery. I told him to find the deed on the building. I told him to be in his office at 7 in the morning. He started to ask questions. I told him I would explain everything then. I went to my truck. I drove to the Marriott 4 blocks away. I paid for a room in cash. I sat on the edge of the bed, and I thought about the 30 years that had brought me to that sidewalk. My name is Walter. I grew up in West Texas, the son of a man who poured concrete and a woman who stretched a dollar until it screamed. When I was 19, I started a landscaping company with a borrowed truck and a secondhand mower. By the time I was 35, Greer Outdoor Services had 12 crews, a fleet of equipment, and contracts with 3 of the largest commercial developers in Central Texas. I built that company with my hands and my reputation, not with investors, not with borrowed philosophy from business school, with early mornings and straight dealing and the simple understanding that if you do what you say you are going to do, people will keep calling you. My wife, Carol, ran the books for the first 15 years. She was the one who insisted we save, who refused to lease when we could own, who set aside money for our daughter's future even when our daughter was still too young to know she had one. Carol died of ovarian cancer when our daughter was 22. It was the worst thing that has ever happened to me, and I include everything else that came after. My daughter, I will call her by her nickname, the one Carol gave her. Elle, she was a bright girl, creative. She had her mother's eyes and her mother's ambition and, unfortunately, her mother's habit of seeing the best in people long past the point when the evidence demanded otherwise. She met her husband in culinary school in Austin. He was from money, or he claimed to be. His family had owned a restaurant group in Houston that had gone under before he was old enough to take it over. He carried that failure like a crown, as though it made him nobility. He was charming in the way that certain men are charming, entirely for their own benefit. I saw it the first time she brought him home for Christmas. I have been reading men my whole career. You have to. You learn to see which ones will still be standing when the job gets hard. He was not one of those men, but Elle loved him. And Carol was gone, and I was not going to be the father who stood between his daughter and her happiness. So I swallowed what I saw, and I smiled, and I shook his hand, and when she called me 3 years later and told me they had a plan, a real plan, a restaurant with a real concept and a real location and real investor interest, I listened. He presented it to me like a pitch deck. He drove up to Abilene and sat across my kitchen table with a laptop and a leather folder and a confidence I could not tell was earned or borrowed. The concept was solid. The location was excellent. The numbers, I had to admit, were not unreasonable. They needed a lead investor, someone to anchor the deal and give the other investors confidence. They needed $350,000. I sold the last commercial property Carol and I had held together, a small office building in San Marcos we had owned outright since 2009. I sold it, I took the cash, and I wrote the check. I made sure the loan agreement was iron, drafted by my attorney, signed and notarized. The building would be leased in my name, with an option for them to purchase it at market rate once the restaurant reached 3 consecutive profitable quarters. The loan would be repaid within 5 years at 4%. He signed without reading it carefully. I noticed. Elle signed without reading it at all. I noticed that too. For 2 years, I stayed out of the way. I asked for quarterly reports, which arrived late and were vague. I asked to see the books twice, and both times he told me the accountant was in the middle of a reconciliation. I drove down for the soft opening and sat in a corner booth and ate a meal that was genuinely good and felt, for the first time in 2 years, like the money might have been worth it. Then came the grand opening, the real one, with the press and the investors and the mayor's office and the food critics and the 47 people in that room who were supposed to represent the future of the thing I had funded with everything Carol and I had saved. And I came in my best sport coat with my shined boots, and my son-in-law put his hand over the microphone and told me I was an embarrassment to the establishment. I lay in the hotel room that night and I did not sleep. I am not a man who lets himself spiral. I am a man who makes lists. I made a list. At the top of the list, I wrote what I knew for certain. The loan was in my name. The building lease was in my name. The original $350,000 came from me, documented, with a signed agreement. I was not a silent donor. I was a creditor. I was a landlord. Below that I wrote what I suspected. I suspected the books were not clean. I suspected the investor presentations had described my role in a way that was convenient rather than accurate. I suspected that my son-in-law had spent the last 2 years building a version of this story where I was the rich old man from Texas who handed over a check and then went back to his rocking chair, and where he was the visionary who built something from nothing. Below that I wrote what I needed to find out. I needed to see the actual financials. I needed to know who else had invested and what they had been told. I needed to know if my name appeared anywhere in the documents that had been shown to those 47 people in that room. I fell asleep at 2 a.m. At 6:45 I was up, showered, dressed. I stopped at a diner on the way to the attorney's office and ate eggs and drank 2 cups of coffee and read the local business section. There was a small item about the grand opening. The restaurant was described as the vision of rising restaurateur Cade Ellery and his team. There was no mention of a lead investor. There was no mention of a loan. There was no mention of a man from Abilene who had sold his wife's last asset to make the thing possible. I folded the paper. I left a 10 on the table. I walked to my attorney's office. His name is Morris. He has been my attorney for 22 years. He is not flashy. He keeps his suits from Brooks Brothers and his opinions to himself until he has finished reading everything. When I walked in and laid out what I knew, he read the loan agreement twice. He pulled up the commercial lease on his screen. He looked at everything slowly and said nothing for 3 minutes. Then he said, "Walk me through the grand opening." I walked him through it. He said, "You understand that what he did last night is the least of your problems and also the most useful thing he could have done." I said, "I understand." He said, "I need to make some calls. I need to pull the articles of organization for the LLC he filed for this restaurant. I need to know if your name is listed as a creditor of record in any public filing. Give me until noon." I went back to the hotel. I sat in the lobby. I called my daughter. She did not answer. I left a message that said I hoped the opening had gone well, that I had needed some air, and that I would like to meet for coffee when she had a moment. My voice was level. I had nothing to gain from anger at this stage. At 11:15, Morris called me back. He said, "Come back in. And Walter, bring your copy of the loan agreement." I came back in. He closed the office door and sat down and laid a stack of papers on the desk. He did not look upset. Morris never looks upset. He looks like a man who has been hired to contain damage, and he is very good at his job. He said, "The LLC was filed 14 months ago. You are not listed as a creditor of record in the filing. The loan agreement you have is valid and enforceable, but it does not appear in any of their incorporation documents. What does appear is a second loan from a private equity group out of Nashville for $200,000, signed 6 months after your agreement. I said, they took on a second investor without my knowledge. He said, without disclosing your prior creditor position to the new investor, yes, which means the new investor made their decision without knowing a prior lien existed. I said, is that fraud? He said, that is a question for a different conversation. But it is, at minimum, a significant problem. And there is more. He pulled out another sheet. He said, I had a colleague pull the quarterly tax filings. The reported revenue for the first 18 months of operation is substantially lower than what a restaurant of that size and that price point would reasonably generate. Either the business is dramatically underperforming, or revenue is being managed in a way that reduces the taxable number. I looked at the sheet. I have read financial documents my whole life. I know what healthy numbers look like, and I know what managed numbers look like. These were managed numbers. I said, how much has been repaid on my loan? Morris said, 0. I said, it has been 2 years. He said, correct. I sat back in my chair. I thought about Carol. I thought about the years she spent adding to that San Marcos property fund, the tenants she managed herself, the repairs she handled with a list, and a contractor she trusted, and a patience I never fully matched. I thought about the office building that had been her idea, her project, her legacy, the one tangible thing she had wanted to leave to Elle. I said, Morris, I want you to draft a notice of default on the loan. I want it delivered to the business address by certified mail and by hand delivery today. He said, that is the first step. But Walter, you need to understand, once you file the default, this becomes public record. Elle will know. The Nashville investors will know. His investors at the party last night will know. I said, good. Because right now I am the only one who knows the truth, and that is a disadvantage. Morris nodded. He picked up his pen. I said, and the building. He said, the lease is in your name. They are month to month. The option to purchase is contingent on 3 consecutive profitable quarters, which, based on these filings, they have not had. The lease can be terminated with 60 days' notice under Texas commercial lease law. I said, draft the termination notice alongside the default. He said, both today. I said, both today. I left the office at 1 in the afternoon. I walked to a park 2 blocks over and sat on a bench and ate a sandwich I had picked up from a deli. The sun was warm. There was a man throwing a ball for a dog near the fountain. I sat there for 20 minutes and thought about the thing I was about to do. I am not a man who acts from anger. Anger is a fire, and fire is not a tool, it is a hazard. I had converted the anger I felt on that sidewalk last night into something colder and more useful. I had converted it into clarity. What I was doing was not revenge. Revenge is personal. What I was doing was enforcing a contract that had been dishonored. What I was doing was collecting a debt that was owed. The fact that the debt was owed by my daughter's husband was painful. The fact that my daughter had stood 3 feet away and laughed while he humiliated me was something I would sit with for the rest of my life. But it did not change the math. And I have always been a man who trusts the math. My phone buzzed at 2:15. It was Elle. I answered. She said, Dad, I am so sorry about last night. He was just stressed. You know how he gets before a big event. I said, I do know how he gets. She said, he didn't mean it the way it came out. You know you are important to us. You know this whole thing wouldn't exist without you. I said, that is true, Elle. It would not. She said, so, can we have dinner tonight? Can we start over? He wants to apologize in person. I thought about the papers Morris was drafting at that moment. I said, I don't think tonight is the right time, but I will see you soon. I promise. She said, Dad, are you okay? I said, I have never been clearer in my life. I hung up the phone. At 4 o'clock, Morris sent me the signed and dated documents. 2 certified delivery receipts confirmed they had been signed for at the restaurant's front desk at 3:47 in the afternoon by a member of the waitstaff. The default notice on the loan, the 60-day lease termination for the building at 4217 McKinney Avenue, At 5 o'clock, my phone began to ring. I did not answer. At 5:15 it rang again. At 5:30 it rang 4 times in a row. At 5:45, a text appeared from a number I did not recognize, and I understood from the area code that it was the Nashville Equity Group's attorney. I sent it to Morris. At 6 o'clock, my daughter called, and I could hear from her voice that she had been crying. She said, "Dad, what did you do?" She said it without a question mark, which meant she already knew the answer and she needed someone to confirm she was not in a dream. I said, "I enforced the agreement your husband signed." She said, "You are going to destroy everything." I said, "No, he already destroyed it. I am just refusing to pretend otherwise." She went quiet. Then she said, in a smaller voice than I had heard from her since she was a child, "Did you mean it? About the building?" I said, "I mean everything I put in writing, Elle. You know that about me. You have always known that about me." She said, "He is saying you are doing this because he embarrassed you last night. He is saying this is personal." I said, "He embarrassed me in front of 47 people and 3 journalists in the mayor's office, in a building I own, at an event funded by money I earned, at a business that exists because I chose to trust him. But no, this is not personal. It is contractual. He is in default. The building lease is terminated. Those are facts. The embarrassment is just context." She started crying again. I stayed on the line. I did not tell her to stop. I did not tell her it would be okay. I do not make promises I cannot keep. After a while, she said, "What are we supposed to do about the building? The investors think they have a 2-year lease on that location." I said, "Then your husband should have told them the truth about who owned the building before he brought in their money." She said nothing. I said, "Elle, I love you. None of what is about to happen changes that. But I will not be invisible. I will not be the man your husband parks in the back and brings out when he needs a check. Your mother worked too hard for that money. I worked too hard for that money. And you know she would say the same thing." She hung up. I went to the hotel restaurant and ate a steak and drank 1 glass of bourbon. I slept 8 hours. In the morning, Morris called at 8:30. He said the Nashville Equity Group was threatening to file an injunction. He said he had already spoken to their attorney and pointed out that his clients had made an investment decision without disclosure of a prior creditor, which was a problem for them, not for me. He said the injunction threat had been withdrawn within 40 minutes. He said, "There is something else." I said, "Tell me." He said, "I had our forensic accountant take a preliminary look at the documents you provided, the tax filings and the quarterly statements. There is a pattern of cash transactions that are not appearing in the deposited revenue totals. It is consistent with a skimming operation. Someone is pulling cash receipts before they hit the register." I said, "How much?" He said, "Conservatively, based on the volume of the restaurant and the gap between reported and estimated revenue, somewhere between $80,000 and $120,000 over 18 months. I sat with that number for a moment. I thought about the Porsche in the restaurant parking lot I had seen last night. I thought about the vacation photos Elle had posted from Portugal 3 months ago. I thought about the quarterly reports that arrived late and said nothing. I said, "Forward everything to the IRS tip line and the Texas Comptroller's office. Anonymous submission." Morris was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Once that is done, it cannot be undone." I said, "He made that decision 18 months ago when he started pulling cash. I am just making sure the records catch up to the reality." Morris said, "Done." I spent that morning walking around Dallas. I walked through the Katy Trail. I walked past the park where I used to bring Elle when she was small and Carol was still alive, and we would come up to visit Carol's sister, and I would hold Elle on my shoulders so she could see over the crowd at the farmers market. Elle used to reach down and put her hands over my eyes and say, "Guess who?" And I would say, "I have no idea," and she would laugh so hard she nearly fell. I thought about that laugh. I thought about how I would spend the rest of my life loving the girl who made that laugh, even if the woman she had become was going to make things very complicated for a while. At noon, I drove to the restaurant. I parked across the street. The lunch service was running. Through the front window, I could see tables full of people. The place looked good. The truth is, it looked genuinely good. And there was a part of me that felt a grief about that, because something real had been built there, and it was built partly with my labor and partly with Carol's legacy, and watching it operate while knowing what I knew felt like watching a beautiful house sitting on a cracked foundation. My son-in-law came out the front door at 12:15. He was on his phone. He was in chef whites with the collar open and his hair pushed back. He was a good-looking man, I will grant him that. He had the kind of energy that fills a room, the kind of confidence that investors love because it feels like certainty even when it is not. He paced the sidewalk while he talked. Then he turned and saw my truck. He stopped. I stepped out. I adjusted my jacket. I walked across the street. He ended the call. He watched me come. He looked like a man deciding whether to run or stand, and I could tell from the calculation in his eyes that he had decided standing would look better. He said, "Walter, I was going to call you." I said, "You had 14 months to call me about the second investor. You had 24 months to make a payment on the loan. You had 47 opportunities last night, one for every person in the room, to introduce me as the man who made this possible. But you chose that moment, at the microphone, to tell me I was an embarrassment." He said, "That was out of line. I am not going to pretend otherwise. But what you did those notices, do you understand what that does to us? Do you understand we have a service tonight? We have 40 reservations. We have staff who depend on this place?" I said, "I understand all of that." He said, "Then how can you do this to Elle? She is your daughter." I said, "I am not doing this to Elle. I am doing this to you. And the difference matters." He moved toward me. Not aggressively, but the way men move when they want to close the distance and lower the volume and have the conversation on their terms. I did not step back. I have not stepped back from a man in 40 years. He said quieter, "Walter, listen, I know things got complicated. I know I should have been more transparent. But if you pull the building out from under us right now, we are finished. Everything we built is finished. Is that what you want? You want to watch it burn?" I said, "You watched something burn last night. You stood at a microphone and you burned the respect your wife's father came 4 hours to give you. I did not pull this building out from under you. You did that the moment you decided that my name, my money, and my presence were all things you could use when convenient and discard when they were not." He stared at me. I could see him cycling through his options. Charm had not worked. Guilt had not worked. He looked like a man whose GPS had stopped working and who was trying to recognize a road he had never actually driven. He said, "What do you want? Just tell me what you want and we can fix this." I said, "There is nothing to fix. The default notice stands. The lease termination stands. You have 60 days to make arrangements for the building. If you want to discuss a buyout of the lease at fair market value, Morris will take that call. Otherwise, we are done here." I turned and walked back to my truck. He called after me once. I did not turn around. I got in the truck, and I drove north out of Dallas on 75, and I did not stop until I was past McKinney, past Sherman, past Denison, past the Red River into Oklahoma, and I pulled off at a rest stop and I sat there in the cab of my truck for 15 minutes with the engine running and my hands on the wheel. I was not crying. I want to be clear about that. I was doing something else. I was releasing the part of me that had spent 2 years biting my tongue at late quarterly reports and vague explanations and the subtle, steady process by which my son-in-law had been rewriting the origin story of the thing I built. I was releasing the version of myself who drove 4 hours in his best sport coat and shined his boots because he wanted his daughter to see him proud of her. I released it. I set it down at a rest stop in Oklahoma like a bag I was done carrying. Then I got back on the road. I drove straight through to Abilene, got home at 9 that night, fed the dog, sat on the back porch with a cup of coffee, and looked at the sky, which in West Texas at night is the most extravagant thing in the world, free to anyone willing to step outside and look up. Over the next 2 weeks, the situation resolved itself with the cold efficiency of paperwork. The Nashville investors, once they understood the full picture, hired their own attorney and began separate proceedings against my son-in-law for the non-disclosure. The IRS tip generated a field inquiry that, Morris told me, was likely to turn into a full audit within 60 days. The Texas Comptroller's Office opened a parallel investigation into the cash handling discrepancy. My son-in-law hired an attorney. His attorney called Morris 3 times in 4 days. On the third call, they opened negotiations on a buyout of the building lease. Elle called me on a Thursday evening, 11 days after Dallas. She called from a number I did not recognize. I answered anyway. She said, "I left." I said, "Are you safe?" She said, "I am at Aunt Miriam's in Fort Worth." I said, "Good." She said, "He told me about the cash. He told me everything. He has been doing it since month 3. He said he was going to put it back before anyone noticed. He said," she stopped. Then she said, "I did not know, Dad. I want you to know that I did not know." I said, "I believe you." She said, "I stood there that night at the opening, and I let him. I did not say anything. I should have." I said, "You do not have to do this right now." She said, "I am so sorry. I am so sorry for what he said to you." I said, "Apology accepted. Now stop apologizing and tell me what you need." We talked for an hour. When we were done, I sat on the porch again and looked at the sky again, and I thought about Carol, the way I often do when something hard has broken open into something that might, given enough time, become something worth having. Morris settled the building lease buyout 6 weeks after the default notice. The number was fair. It was not what the building was worth to me personally, but it was what the market said it was worth. And I have always trusted the market over sentiment. My son-in-law kept the restaurant through the transition. Whether it survived the IRS audit, I cannot tell you. It was not my problem anymore. I had signed the deed transfer and received the wire, and that chapter was closed. I took the money, added it to what I had from the loan repayment that came as part of the settlement, and I did something Carol and I had talked about for 20 years. I bought 40 acres in the hill country outside Fredericksburg. Rocky soil, cedar trees, a creek that runs through the lower pasture. There is a small house on it that needs work, which suits me fine because I know how to do the work. I moved out of Abilene in October. I loaded the truck myself. I took the tools and the furniture that meant something and left the rest for whoever came next. I took the photo of Carol from the mantle, the one from our trip to Colorado in 1998 where she is laughing at something off camera and her hair is in her face and she looks like the most alive person in the world. I drove west into the hill country in the late afternoon, into the long gold light that does not exist anywhere else the way it exists in Texas in the fall. The cedar smell came through the windows. I put on the radio. I drove past the sign for Fredericksburg and turned onto the county road, and the pavement ended and the caliche started. The white dust rising up behind my tires the way it has my whole life, and I felt something that took me a moment to name. I felt like myself again. I had spent 2 years making myself smaller so that something I had paid for could look bigger. I had eaten the silence of those late quarterly reports. I had driven 4 hours and shined my boots and sat at a corner table and been grateful to be included. I had told myself it was patience, that it was generosity, that it was what a good father does when his child is building something. But it was not any of those things. It was the slow, quiet erasure of a man who had given too much to people who had confused generosity for weakness. My daughter calls me on Sundays now. The divorce is underway. She is back in school, finishing a business degree she put on hold when she married him. She comes out to Fredericksburg sometimes on weekends and sits on the porch and drinks coffee and talks about the future she is rebuilding. And I listen the way I should have listened more often when her mother was alive and the future felt endless. Last Sunday she asked me if I regretted any of it. The loan, the building, the whole thing from the beginning. I told her the truth. I said I did not regret giving her the money. I said I did not regret wanting to be there for her, the way her mother and I had always tried to be there for her. I said the only thing I regretted was taking 2 years to enforce the contract instead of 18 months. She laughed. It was the same laugh from the farmer's market when she was 5 years old on my shoulders with her hands over my eyes, and it was the best sound I had heard in longer than I could remember. I looked out at the cedar trees in the evening light. I thought about the 40 years I had spent building things that were meant to last. I thought about the things that had lasted and the things that had not. I thought about the difference between a structure built on a solid foundation and one built on the promise of what someone else hopes it will become. The creek was running in the lower pasture. I could hear it from the porch. Carol would have loved this place. She would have wanted a garden near the creek. She would have kept a list of what to plant in the spring. I am keeping the list for her. Some men reach 67 and feel like they are running out of road. I drove onto 40 acres in the hill country in October and felt like I was standing at the start of something. I do not need anyone's permission for that. I do not need anyone to hand me a microphone or save me a seat in the front row. I built my own front row a long time ago, and I paid for every seat in it. If you have ever poured everything you had into someone else's dream and watched them pretend you were never part of it, you already know what I am talking about. Hit like and subscribe to Voice of Father for more stories like this.